To what extent have policy changes been effective in addressing homophobic bullying in schools?
UNESCO describes homophobic bullying as someone repeatedly being a victim of aggressive behaviour, including physical and verbal attack, fighting and psychological manipulation. Homophobic bullying is one attack on an individual or group because of their sexual identity. There are two types of bullying: direct, which is aimed at an individual or group. For example, if someone directly avoided someone in the corridor because they were, say, in their words, a dyke or a puff. Indirect bullying is not directly the abuse of a particular person. It would be, for example, if somebody said to someone else, "Your jumper is so gay." This is using gay as a negative comment and is therefore derogatory towards someone then being gay. Armstrong says that defining inclusion is by no means clear. However, other theorists have explored into finding a meaning to inclusion, including Anisha Ayal, who says that inclusion is the acceptance of a student with a disability, giving them an unconditional belonging to a classroom, school, and community. This contrasts with the terms integration or mainstreaming, which is often used for students with disabilities, because this implies that the student is a visitor rather than having the same rights in their position as any other student. It's also been found that children have different views and different behaviour towards students with disabilities that have been put in through integration or mainstreaming. However, in the terms of homophobic bullying, it would be ensuring that someone with a different sexuality or sexual identity had the same rights as someone who was heterosexual. Mitchell, 2005, emphasises that the fact that inclusion extends beyond just people with disabilities by saying that it includes consideration of other sources of disadvantage and marginalisation, such as gender, poverty, language, ethnicity, and geographical isolation. This would also apply to being in a homosexual minority group, as it's also seen as a source of disadvantage. The complex interrelationships that exist among these factors and their interactions with disability must also be a focus of attention.
Policy before the repeal of Section 28. The 1967 Sexual Offences Act decriminalised homosexual acts. This was a big step in the movement towards the acceptance of homosexuals. Section 28 was an extremely controversial piece of legislation that prevented local authorities from promoting homosexuality. It was put into place due to moral panic in promoting homosexuality, which was caused mainly by children's books which spoke about gay parents. It stated that local authorities shall not intentionally promote homosexuality or publish material with the intention of promoting homosexuality, promote the teaching in any maintained school of the acceptability of homosexuality as a pretended family relationship. This act brought confusion to teachers, and when asked, 44% of teachers said that it had caused difficulty in meeting the needs of gay, lesbian and bisexual pupils.
The main arguments against Section 28 were that it discriminated against homosexuals and hence was an intolerant and unjust law. It excluded homosexual support groups and then so appeared to prevent teachers from protecting victims of homophobic bullying. It was actually endangering vulnerable children. It made the assumption that homosexuals were inherently dangerous to children, implying an association between homosexuality and paedophilia, as obvious from the predatory homosexual arguments of the supporters of the law. Section 28 was a law that gave an impression to the public that the government sanctioned homophobia. The idea that homosexuality could be promoted implied that homosexuality was a choice which people could be persuaded to make, in contrast to the section's opponents' view that homosexuality is biologically determined. It was no longer relevant to the Learning Acts of 2000, which said that it made provision about education and training for connected purposes. It provided education and training for all young people and gave them equal opportunities, trying to be more inclusive. It also was no longer relevant to the Education Act of 1996, which made way for children with special needs. It made assessment of different needs, taking into consideration educational, medical and psychological factors, which could include if somebody was curious about their sexuality. The government aimed to introduce policy that addressed inclusion, therefore Section 28 didn't fit with this as it excluded homosexual people. Stonewall says that they thought that schools couldn't do anything to prevent homophobic bullying because they thought they'd be breaking the law. They thought they couldn't say anything positive about being lesbian, gay or bisexual, or even provide resources for gay pupils like books or information about youth groups. This meant that any pupil who were lesbian, gay or bisexual thought they might be often found that they had nobody to talk to, no one to stand up for, and if they were being bullied, they had no access to helpful information.
This quote shows an example of direct bullying that shows that despite policy reforms, homophobic bullying still continues in schools.
Stonewall is a lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender rights charity named after Stonewall Inn, which was a safe haven for the gay community during the riots in 1969 in New York. Stonewall campaigns to change the way people think about lesbian, gay, bisexual communities to create an inclusive environment at home, at school and at work. In schools, Stonewall focuses on stopping homophobic bullying to ensure that every young person, regardless of their sexual orientation, has the right to have a chance at getting the best education possible in a school where they feel safe, happy and free from fear of bullying. Although the repeal of Section 28 enabled schools to address different sexualities, some schools didn't know how to tackle homophobic bullying, or it didn't change the views of the teachers in the schools. Therefore, it continues to be an issue in modern schools. Stonewall found that still over 150,000 gay pupils still experience bullying, and 35% of gay young people say their school isn't an accepting, tolerant or welcoming place for them, which has caused a lot of truancy amongst these people. Consequently, Stonewall helps schools in supporting and educating their pupils about lesbian, gay, bisexual communities, including creating the famous "Some People Are Gay, Get Over It" campaign.
So why is it that despite policy change, homophobic bullying in schools continues to persist? Rigby 2003 said that bullying can be explained by socio-cultural influences. The socio-cultural influences most relevant to homophobic bullying would be attitudes of influential figures such as parents and teachers, what the culture perceives to be normal, and the media and discourses in society. Teachers and parents are reluctant to challenge heterosexuality, which reflects on students, particularly young men, who tend to define themselves by masculinity. Teachers regulate children playing out heterosexual fantasies in schools and reinforce gender roles in schools. This illustrates that policy reform is not the only influential factor in homophobic bullying. Elizabeth Mayer's 2009 states that teachers' view has to be consistent alongside anti-homophobia policies and strategies to effectively tackle bullying. Mayer suggests that involving families and communities to create policies regarding bullying and harassment would be a valuable way of educating the whole community against homophobia. The Stonewall report found that pupils who have been taught about homosexuality in schools are 60% more likely to feel happy at school and 40% more likely to feel respected, maybe suggesting that policymakers could look at the curriculum to improve the situation of homophobic bullying. There is also theoretical evidence to suggest that systems which create exclusion are more complex than simply changing policy. One example of this is Folkart. The goal of his work was to create a history of the different modes by which, in our culture, human beings are made subjects, in this case, homosexuals. Discourse is the term used to speak about systems of language which are also used to reinforce power and exclusion. They are not, however, simply relating to language and speech. They are systems for producing what truths are allowed to be said. For example, media, literary text, and the opinions of powerful people. Folkart spoke about how each society has an idea about types of discourse which are accepted, and how the discourses cause exclusion and the oppression of the less powerful. He said there are various ways of knowing what is accepted to be true in a society, one of which is the status of those who are saying it is true. The lack of homosexual policymakers in the UK and the fact that homosexuals are a minority would indicate that they are less powerful and therefore likely to be oppressed by discourse. Some discourses produce understandings of social and systematic practice as a way of telling if individuals are behaving and functioning properly. For example, discourses around Section 28 would imply that homosexuals are not normal or functioning properly. He said that discipline and normalisation were two terms that cannot be separated, and he explained how society uses discipline to make people act normally and used being abnormal as a form of discipline. His book, Discipline and Punished, was used to draw parallels between the education system's discipline and methods in prison. He said that institutions were used to reproduce power inequalities. These power inequalities are more likely to encourage homosexual bullying than help it. There have been many changes over the past 10 years in gay rights, including the Adoption of Children Act 2002, which made it legal for gay couples to adopt children, the Criminal Justice Act 2003, which made the discrimination of sexuality a reason for abuse in court, the Civil Partnership Act 2004, which made it legal for gay people to have a civil partnership. However, marriage is still not legal in the UK, and plans to legalise gay marriage will be voted on in the House of Commons on the 5th of February 2013. The Equality Act 2010 cited homophobia as one of the types of discrimination that needs to be tackled in all sorts of areas, including education. The influence of policy on public opinion can be varied. It can have no influence or it can have an enormous influence. It is believed that policymakers have the ability to drive the public towards their opinion. Therefore, change of policy would mean change of public opinion. From this, it would be thought possible to deduct that a change in gay rights would be equal to a change in public opinion of gay people, meaning less homophobic bullying in schools. However, this is not entirely the case, argues Stonewall. Herring suggests that we owe to Folkart the insight that the social institutions themselves are constructed and maintained through discourse. He suggested that this was particularly true of the internet community of users who come together and share information, changing what is accepted as truth. This could work as a positive or negative factor in reducing homophobic bullying, depending on whether the internet users are posting content that is supporting homosexuality or not. McNamara argues that media plays a positive role in addressing homophobic bullying. He said that the increase in discourses in the media have provided visibility for the gay community, decreasing homophobia. However, Mercado says that there is a new form of homophobia transmitted through the media, which speaks about having homosexuals on TV not necessarily contributing to acceptance. It gives them a visibility, he warned, but he said we should not misinterpret this visibility as acceptance. We live in a heteronormative culture, which is reinforced through textbooks in schools. And Seidman said that heteronormativity was a product of the knowledges that organised society. This makes it similar to the point of the one Folkart made about discourse. Bidoff said that there were three main types of discourse that generate a silence around homosexuality in schools, which are discourses which protect children from sexual knowledge, that explain childhood innocence, and that imply homosexuality as pathology. Having these discourses in schools could be particularly negatively influential.
Paulo Freire has also contributed to theory which can be used to explain why a change of policy may not be enough to end homophobic bullying in schools. Freire's banking concept of education argues that the teacher leads the students to memorise mechanically the narrated content. Worse yet, it turns them into containers or receptacles to be filled by the teacher. This type of education, by Freire's view, does not focus on the individual, which therefore appears to be an exclusionary education, because in the banking concept of education, knowledge is a gift bestowed by those who consider themselves knowledgeable upon those who they consider know nothing, rather than addressing the needs and differences of each person. Freire believed that the teacher must become student among student to create an inclusive classroom because it would enable sharing of dialogue and critical thoughts. Therefore, the change of policy does not address this didactic way of teaching because it doesn't change teacher training or the curriculum in schools. Consequently, it doesn't look at the needs of each child.
To conclude, we have found that over the years, government policy in the UK has put a lot more focus on the importance of being inclusive for many groups of people, including gay, lesbian and bisexual groups. Gay rights movements over the last century have made life for homosexual people more inclusive, particularly since the repeal of Section 28. Despite the repeal of Section 28, the charity Stonewall has found that there is still a lot of prejudice against homosexual people, particularly in the school environment. They found that whilst making the Stonewall report, that over 150,000 gay pupils across the UK are still victims of homophobic abuse. Reasons we found for this continuation of homophobic abuse, despite policy change, are some socio-cultural factors still embedded in society, such as opinions of important people in the people's lives, for example, teachers, peers, family, and media figures. Theorists such as Frere and Folkart can also be used to explain how the system of creating an inclusive environment is far more complex than simply changing policy, as we have systems of oppression that stand in the way of this.